Excellent. I'm excited actually because we're getting into this. We'll be doing this with our eyes closed.
Yes, we could.
People will be going, why have they got their eyes closed? uh, hello and welcome back to Double Feature Film Chat Show. I'm here with Wayne Byrne. Say hello, Wayne.
Hello, everybody.
And we're going to talk about our two films this week are Hondo and Vera Cruz. For no good reason, we just threw these films at each other. Well, I threw them at us. And we decided we'd talk about 50s films, which, Wayne, you weren't too happy with. You said, give me 40s or 60s. But you had an issue with the 50s, which I love to hear more about.
Well, I just think there was some immediate ones from the 40s and 60s that probably would have grabbed me a bit more. But when you said the 50s, there are several, 50s Westerns that I love. But I tried to think of one that wasn't as obvious, I guess, something that would be a bit more interesting and unusual in that canon. And I guess the one I came up with, which was Hondo. And for me, it's always been a bit of an outlier in the Wayne canon, and especially in the 50s era for numerous reasons. So that's why I went with that one.
How would you mark the change in 50s Western style as opposed to what was, basically call it post-war. We're talking post-war Western here.
Yeah, well, it's in that kind of middle ground of old Hollywood versus new Hollywood, in that the 1940 stuff was, the classical era kind of stuff, John Ford and all that kind of thing. And then when you got into the 60s, you had people like Sam Peckinpah, who were completely changing the rule book on how you shot Westerns, made Westerns. And of course, it was the new Hollywood era, so cinema was changing. So the 50s is kind of caught somewhere in between the two. There's classical elements, but in the likes of Vera Cruz in particular, I think there's some hints of things to come in terms of the way action was shot and violence was depicted on screen. But Hondo in particular is more on the traditional side, but it's interesting from an industrial point of view because it was shot in 3D. It was made by John Farrow, co-star Geraldine Page, who was a New York stage actress, so she's kind of coming from a different school of performance than the likes of John Wayne and Ward Bond and people like that. There's certain things about it that are just mark it out as being slightly different than other 50s Westerns and 50s Wayne Westerns in particular. But in general, it's quite classical in its construction and its style.
It's based on a Louis L'Amour story, who's another one of those kind of great Western novelists who wasn't really great in terms of cinema. Certainly not in the 50s. That was probably a very rare adaptation.
Yeah, and it's quite, the story is quite threadbare. There's not a whole lot of plot there. It's quite simple. It's John Wayne plays a cavalry rider who stumbles across the homestead of Geraldine Page, who has been seemingly abandoned by her husband, and she's left on the farm with her young son. And John Wayne comes along and offers to help out for, a bit of hospitality. And then they kind of form a bond, and of course, slowly they fall in love, as you do in these movies.
What's interesting for me is that it cements a version of John Wayne, the legend. He's kind of carrying the entire movie, whereas up until that point, he was a strong force in those movies, but he wasn't necessarily carrying the entire movie.
I think part of that is due to the fact that this was a Batjack production, which was his own company that he founded with Robert Fellows, and also an early co-owner that was also James Edward Grant, who was the screenwriter of this as well. But I think this allowed him. It was an independent production company, and they had a deal with Warner Brothers to distribute them. But it gave Wayne that kind of autonomy and independence to really kind of take control of his career and make the movies he wanted to make. And I think in the long run, kind of craft his image on screen, and Batjack ended up making some of my favorite Wayne films because I love that period, his late period of, from the 50s through the 70s, where you have films like Chisholm, Cal U.S. Marshall, The Cowboys, and one of my favorites, an underrated film, McHugh. Some great stuff in there. We could go through them all, but I'm certainly a fan of some specific ones.
Another thing is interesting is that the film is kind of gets unfairly compared to Shane.
I can see that, especially with the relationship with the son and all that. I don't know. I think Shane is such a standalone masterpiece. You know what I mean? It's kind of hard to compare it in terms of maybe quality. Hondo's very good, but I think Shane is probably on a different level. But yeah, there are some surface similarities.
The Ford stock company creep into it in the form of Ward Bond.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, John Ford worked on this as well. He was apparently in the habit of visiting John Wayne on whatever movies he was working on, much to Wayne's chagrin, because, he didn't want Pappy looking over his shoulder, I'm sure. But apparently the final scenes of Hondo and the big battle sequence was actually directed by John Ford. He took over from Farrow when Farrow had to go. He was contracted to do another movie, and Hondo had run over schedules. In those final scenes, he brings that traditional Ford style, which is these big grand vistas, these long shots, wide shots, and a lot of big sky in the top 2/3 of the screen and a lot of action in the foreground. It's different to Farrow style, who uses a lot of tracking shots and unusual shots. Now, I'm sure they're unusual because the fact that it was shot in 3D and you have some quirky camera angles and some of those obvious 3D camera angles where people are hurtling towards you with knives and daggers and stuff like that. So,
Farrow handles a lot of the domestic stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of domestic stuff in there, and it's well handled. I mean, despite the stories that Geraldine Page was, very much in contrast to all these Western film actors, there is a nice romance there between the two of them, and it's a slow build as well. It's not immediate, like John Wayne's character, he doesn't go straight in for the romantic angle. It's nicely dealt with. And I think that's probably the heart of the film. It's a quiet Western, and I think my favorite elements of it are those domestic scenes with the two of them. I think a good example of the disparity in acting styles on the set came with when Michael Pate was talking to Geraldine Page and she wanted to rehearse a scene with him. And he says, when we're making Westerns in Hollywood, we don't rehearse, we prepare ourselves. Then we come to the set and wait for the director to tell us what to do. And then they roll camera and they capture what we get. So she was obviously coming from a different school of acting and brought different sensibilities than what the likes of Michael Pate and Ward Bond and John Wayne would have been used to. But despite all that, I think there's a wonderful heart there, and it's the center of the film, that relationship between Geraldine Page and John Wayne. So for me, that's the best thing about it. It's not, the war scenes the fight scenes are great and it looks beautiful. It's a gorgeous film. Robert Burks was the original cinematographer on it, and it has that wonderfully rich color that he brought to the films he did with Hitchcock, including Vertigo and Dial M for Murder and Rear Window and all that. But then when John Farrow had left, Robert Burks went with him, and Archie Stout came on to shoot the film with John Ford, and he had worked with John Ford and John Wayne quite a bit. So I guess that's why those Fordian sensibilities and aesthetics are present. I mean, it's a slow burning film. It's not an action film, and it's quite a contrast, I think, to Vera Cruz, and that's why I think these are two interesting movies to talk about. Very much
segue, Wayne. I like it.
There you go. That's why you're paying me the big bucks, isn't it?
Vera Cruz is a bawdy, nasty little piece of a film, especially by 50 standards. I think the gangster genre was certainly getting tougher in the 50s as it had been in the 30s. In the 40s, as you say, they were more kind of elegiac, and they were quieter about their boldness. But it starts as a kind of black comedy, and then it gets darker as it goes along. To set out the plot, it's basically set during the Franco-Mexican War. Maximilian's in charge, and the Juarez are trying to fight for freedom and revolution, which Mexicans seem to have been doing forever. And into this terrain comes the likes of Gary Cooper as Ben Train and Joe Erin, played by Burt Lancaster. It should be noted, both of these films were led by their leading man. Burt Lancaster produced, that was his second production with his company, Hecht Hill, was it?
Yep.
And I think, again, it's a kind of beginning of a style. It's like kind of like a land-based pirate movie in some ways. It has a lot of richness and kind of big epic stuff going on. Not so much you felt it, but I thought there is enough epic going on in terms of ballroom scenes and lots of horses rather than small amounts of horses.
Yeah, I mean, it's an elaborate production, but I don't think, when you look back at the poster campaign and the marketing and stuff, they really kind of advertised it as this big, expansive.
Well, it was CinemaScope, don't forget.
Western.
CinemaScope is still kind of coming into itself.
Yeah, but I think it's
I was telling you that lovely quote I came across by Fritz Lang about CinemaScope, and he was giving out about it, and he said it's only good for filming snakes and funerals. I'm not sure did Fritz Lang actually shoot CinemaScope? Sorry to be talking about a different director now. What we're talking about Vera Cruz.
Not that I can think of. Any films that come to mind from Fritz Lang are always in kind of that Academy ratio.
But back to Vera Cruz. Yeah, so it's just about dirty mercenaries down trying to make a buck in Mexico. Gary Cooper comes with a lot of skill and talent as an ex-soldier who lost the in the American Civil War. He immediately runs into Burt Lancaster, whose performance is basically one giant set of teeth. And the term shit-eating grin was made for Burt Lancaster. And he's an absolute joy because he's just never made villainy so sexy. You just about hang out with Gary Cooper at the end because you know he's the good guy. And we know there's love between the two men. I'd forgotten the end. Okay, remember, guys, spoilers here. At the end, he shoots Joe Aaron, right? I love the fact his name is Aaron, you know? Not Aaron Soups, but Aaron the country. And he shoots him, and there's a wonderful moment of welled up tears in his eyes at the end after he's killed him.
Yeah, I mean, there is that kind of what we would probably more associate with the Peckinpah kind of thing of the Wild Bunch, you know,
or the Leone.
Yeah, you know, the kind of the respect between two old gunfighters, you know, even though there's a bit of betrayal going on there, there's some kind of wouldn't call it love.
Everybody's tripping over themselves to cheat everybody else. We have a kind of four-way system. We've got Gary Cooper, we've got Burt Lancaster, and then we got Burt Lancaster's boys, you know, played by wonderful performances from Jack Elam, Ernest Borgnine, Charles Buczynski, who went on to be Charles Bronson. And you're going like, wow, this is like half of the Leone and Peckinpah's kind of boys are hanging out here.
Yeah, before Bronson became, you know, the Bronson we know, that kind of rugged hero.
I wonder what Bronson would have been like in a Peckinpah movie.
Well, we saw what he was like in Sergio Leone, and he was absolutely phenomenal in Once Upon a Time in the West.
Definitely, you can see the guts of the Zabata movies and lots of spaghetti scenarios in that film. In that one film.
And that's why I say I don't think it's as big as it was announced to be. To me, it feels more like those spaghetti westerns where it's quite violent, it's action oriented. You know, there's not a whole lot of.
But you see, it has the lavish spectacle of the big costumes and that. That was a very studio bound thing where we have to get like you remember the big dance scene where we get to meet all the posh types and all the nasty mercenaries come along and hang out at the party, making the place look terrible. And we get also there's one giant cock measuring contest going on in the film where people shoot guns and shoot things off things, and which is quite funny. There's a lovely scene between Gary Cooper, Burt Lancaster, and Emperor Maximilian trying to keep up with them. Do you remember that scene where they're shooting the lances off all the soldiers and then shooting the candles that the poor servants are holding, and then Maximilian gets a go, and all these servants shaking in their boots. The Emperor has a go. I just love that scene. But it's very funny. And then it turns left. Once we get into the story of the Juaristas, the Mexican peasants fighting the revolution.
Yeah, well, it's one of the few moments of levity in the film, you know, especially seeing those the servants
it starts
trembling
off
in
that way. I mean, don't forget, the two men are introduced by one selling the other one a stolen horse. Yeah. And there's no real logic to it other than that lovely cheeky moment. And as I said, every time you watch Lancaster grin, you can't help but smile. You know, he's just an absolute fucking bastard.
They're two powerhouses. I mean, Gary Cooper and Burt Lancaster. But for me, I do like Gary Cooper. He's a quieter presence on screen because, well, how can you compare it to Burt Lancaster's teeth? But you know, I don't know. There's a quiet. There's a quiet heroism there in Gary Cooper, and you know, which was evident in other films of his, like Man of the West and High Noon. It's just this kind of, I don't know, dignified, quiet thing.
Cooper brought his own thing to the party all the time. I said he's one of the few actors that could be. He kind of set the kind of standard for the actor who could be himself and the performance at the same time.
Yeah,
the most kind of highly trained actors would say that about him. Charles Lawton apparently was amazed by his performance. I heard one story that he said someone's going on about his wonderful pauses, and he said, "I'm just trying to think of what the next line is." but back to apparently Clark Gable said to him, he said, "You don't want to go on screen with that young fella. He's going to fucking blow you off the screen." As an influencer, this film is unbelievable. Its legacy, as you say, is bigger than in the movie. That's what pretty much what you said there, yeah. But it's second, Robert Aldrich again showing signs of what's going to come. You know, you'd never realize this man was going to make Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. It just, I wouldn't have been.
Yeah, Robert Aldrich is a great director. I mean, geez, he was able to cross genres skillfully, you know, and he made some great films such as The Dirty Dozen, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Kiss Me Deadly, which is one of the great film noirs of the 50s. Went on to do two great Burt Reynolds films, one of which is one of my favorite Burt films and very underrated one, which was Hustle, which was a excellent 70s neo noir and one of the few uses of Burt Reynolds as just this quiet, how do you say, brooding soul, not your typical Burt Reynolds character. But of course, he made a definitive Burt Reynolds film then with The Longest Yard, which was this brilliant sports prison movie. But Aldrich was just he was a master
He
craftsman.
found the fun in mean, like nobody else did.
Yeah, well, there you go, The Mean Machine, The Longest Yard. But also Twilight's Last Gleaming. There's another film I just thought of actually, which is a terrific.
One of Burt Lancaster's great movies, Ulzana's Red.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, another great western and a tough western at that. That was another quite violent. Was that would have been 60? So again, that's what I was saying earlier on.
1971, I think.
Was it? So there you go. So
Might
it's
have been
new
a bit
Hollywood.
later, actually.
Yeah. So that's what I mean. I mean, the 50s kind of bridged that gap between the old classical stuff and then what was to come, which was the 60s and the new Hollywood and kind of directors being allowed to play around a bit more with what they could get away with in terms of action and violence and themes. And I particularly remember Ulzana's Raid being quite tough in places. But you can see the seeds are there in Vera Cruz. Vera Cruz is action packed and it's tough and it's rough, and that's one of the reasons why I like it. I look at Vera Cruz as perhaps not one of the great westerns, even of the 50s. So I'm probably going to disagree with you there, but I do enjoy it as a straight up action western.
Probably one of the great filmmakers of westerns in the 50s was Anthony Mann, whom he didn't go near. And you mentioned one of his films, Man of the West. That kind of psychological kind of storytelling was becoming much more prominent. And then Bud Boetticher, who we both love, who was another huge influence on spaghetti westerns as well. As much so as Vera Cruz, I would say. We're still dealing with kind of more interesting internal stories of these characters.
Well, I think you just mentioned something which was a marker of where westerns were going in the 60s, and which is the psychological realism that these actors were bringing to the roles, and there was a lot more depth, I think, there than say the stuff in the 30s and the 40s, which were just kind of more straight up cowboy movies. Yeah, apart from obviously you had great ones with depth like the Ford films and all that, but I think as the 50s and 60s rolled on, I think there was a lot more depth brought to the Western film. And one of my favorite Westerns actually of the period is One Eyed Jacks, the Marlon Brando film. Brando brought everything in the kitchen sink to that role. He directed it as well. But it's an example of where the Western was going at that stage in terms of the change of aesthetics, the influence of, the Stella Adler and the actor studio, all that kind of stuff, bringing that to the Western genre, which wasn't terribly well known or celebrated as a terribly deep genre, I'm sure, at that stage. But it's a fascinating period to look at the Western genre, because it's for me it looks like it's a period of transition for the Western. But as you were saying earlier on, I probably would have jumped on a few more 60s westerns quicker than I did for Hondo. It took a while for me to kind of pick Hondo. There was a few others I had floating around, but
I was surprised you didn't go for a Jimmy Stewart and Anthony Mann.
I'm trying to balance kind of someone I love, which is John Wayne. John Wayne is just one of those, he's absolute heroes. He's up there with Burt Reynolds to me. So I did want to discuss Wayne.
Well, as I said, it's interesting to mark the two different westerns in terms of, as I say, one is a kind of a dark little kind of a comedy, and the other one is full of ideals and that John Wayne message of being true to yourself and not being a liar, which became prominent messages. I think when anyone went to write one of his later westerns, I'm talking about 60s onward, not Rio Bravo or any of those, they went back to that film to think about the persona.
Yeah, well, that's interesting you mentioned that, because James Edward Grant, who was the screenwriter, he was one of Wayne's favorite screenwriters. They became great friends and he ended up writing a lot for him. But James Edward Grant could be said to be responsible for really honing the John Wayne persona. And as Wayne said, he wrote the kind of lines that he liked to say, which were short, sharp, to the point. Now there's a bit of humor in a lot of it as well. I mean, if you look at McClintock, there's some great lines in there, as there is through a lot of their collaborations. But he apparently nailed the kind of dialogue that Wayne specialized in. Which is
It's interesting to think that when I think Borden Chase was one of the writers on Vera Cruz, he said when he was writing it initially, he wrote it for John Wayne. I
really
cannot imagine John Wayne going near that material.
definitely not. No way. I don't know. There's not a whole lot of Wayne-esque ideals in there, is there, for him to kind of
Well,
grab
I
hold
suppose
of?
like there's a purity to Cooper. He's an honest man at the end of it, and he wants the goal to go to the poor people of Mexico rather than his own pocket by
Yeah,
the end of
and
it.
that was the MacGuffin of the movie, wasn't it? The gold
Yeah.
that was in the
There's
stagecoach
a
all along
rumor
that
that there
everybody
was going to
wanted.
be a sequel to it. I don't believe it. I think it's some nonsense someone put up on IMDb, and
Really?
it
Yeah,
was
there
going to
weren't.
be called "There Really Was a Gold Mine," which is like a typical spaghetti title anyway. Like
Oh, definitely, yeah.
a small chapter. Yes, we will go and get the guns, and then we'll fight Sartana. And we will fight to the death on Tuesday.
If you see Burt Lancaster's teeth, shoot.
But this is it. If go watch Leone, I think I would say the influences for Leone in there are obviously something like A Fistful of Dynamite, but also the dynamic between Lee Van Cleef and Clint Eastwood in For a Few Dollars More.
Yeah, they're not quite as comedic as some of the duos in the spaghettis. They're serious men of few words most of the time. But there is this whole idea of 1 minute, they're saving each other's life, but at the drop of a hat, they'll gun each other down.
It lays its cards on the table from that very first scene with the horse, and he shoots his own horse that's dying, and Burt Lancaster pulls a gun on him, and he says, next time you pull a gun, you better let me know what you're doing. He says, I will if I have time.
Lancaster looks at that as a sign of weakness, that the fact that Gary Cooper has empathy for the animal, and that if he's gonna treat people like that in tense situations, well, that could be a weakness.
We never learned that much about Joe Aaron. We just know he's a tough nut.
Yeah, and that's the thing. As you're watching the film, you wonder, in the end, will they really turn on each other? Will they be that bad after all the things they go through together throughout the film? Will they really end up, in a showdown? And of course they do. But
We'd be disappointed if they didn't.
yeah, but you're kind of hoping they won't. You're kind of hoping that there'll be a friendship.
I think once Burt Lancaster starts beating up women, you go, there's no hope for him.
Exactly. Yeah. Well,
I think Borgnine says to him, "Oh, sorry, they've captured Gary Cooper and they're about to kill him or smash a bottle in his face, actually." And Burt saves him, and he goes, "Oh, sorry, I didn't know he was a friend of yours." He says, "I don't have any friends, not even you."
even you. To me, Vera Cruz is I can see elements of where it influenced other stuff, but I think in and of itself, I don't know if it stands the test of time as well as some of the stuff that it perhaps influenced, some of the Leone stuff.
It does for the first 45 minutes.
Yeah.
The dynamic between Cooper and Lancaster at the start is great, and it gets lost in the politics of the revolution and all that.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And that's when it starts to fall apart. Is when we have new alliances made, and then we're just waiting for that moment when we get Gary and Burt back in action to have that moment where they get to shoot each other. But it is one of the great gunfights.
Oh yeah, there's some great action sequences.
No, but that gunfight at the end is superb.
Oh, it is. Yeah.
Apparently, it's inspired a parody in Mad magazine at the time, where
Really?
yeah, but they basically shoot each other, and then Burt Lancaster's character goes home, and then finally drops dead. And then we see Gary Cooper survive, but he drops dead. But it's only another 3 days later.
Actually, speaking of comic interpretations, I think there's elements of this in John Landis's brilliant Three Amigos.
Oh yeah, I read that somewhere as well. Actually, I think you're absolutely right. From watching it, you can see it. Yeah, but it's also Magnificent Seven.
Yeah, I can see that.
Wayne, what do you suggest we talk about in our next episode?
I suggest we do 60s horror. And I'm going to go for one of my absolute favorite films of all time, which is Carnival of Souls from 1962.
Okay. I will raise you. I'm going to go Hammer. I'm going to throw a Hammer film into the mix, and I'm going to put in one of my favorite Hammer movies, which is Plague of the Zombies. Do you have a copy of that?
I do indeed.
One is in beautiful lurid hammer color, and the other one is beautiful black and white. Okay, well, let's watch those in our next episode. Thank you for tuning in, guys. We hope you found this amusing, and please fill the comments. Please subscribe to our channel, and please tell all your friends. And we look forward to seeing you in our next episode. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening.
I like that. Thanks for listening.